All right, so here is the first tablet of my version of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh Redux, and I've tried to stick as closely as possible to each of the tablets. There's 11 tablets that tell the story, and someone came along later to add a 12th tablet to make it come out in accordance, so it would correspond to the signs of the zodiac. And make no mistake about it, that's what this epic is about. It is the prototype for Hercules in his 12 labors. Hercules is a Greek echo of Gilgamesh, as Samson is a Jewish echo of Gilgamesh. Samson's name comes from Shamash, the name of the sun god, and in that epic it is said that Gilgamesh is walking along the path. Shaduri the barmaid says, you cannot walk along the path of Shamash, and he says, watch me. So he's going through the zodiac. I submitted a paper to the Journal of Near Eastern Studies many years ago, and they said, well, that's not possible because the oldest astronomical text that we have from the Sumerians is the Mullipen tablets, and they date from 1000 BC. What this individual does not know, because he isn't very bright, is that by the time a tradition gets written down, it is already in danger of becoming extinct orally. Homer writes down the Iliad and the Odyssey because the bards aren't learning the tale. In the pyramid texts are 2600 BC, and they don't date until the 5th dynasty because the priests were not learning the lessons. And so they had to inscribe the texts magically into the walls so that the priests wouldn't have to go in there and do it. So by the time myths or astronomy are committed to writing, they've already been up and running for a long, long time. There is no doubt whatsoever, it's not even up for debate, that the Sumerians had 12 constellations, although some of them are different, such as Cancer, which is the constellation of the carpenter, and Aries, which is the constellation of the day laborer. There are some differences. Pisces is the swallow's tail. There are some, but it is 12 signs. There's no doubt about that. Don't let any scholars tell you it's all fabrication and New Age speculation. It absolutely is not. So let's go through the first tablet. Behold the city at dawn. Wire sticks of date palms, parallel rows and segmented vertebrate axes, fantails splayed in dark array against the agate sky. The cubes of its rotting plastered tan houses cored out centers for courtyards, rhomboid, trapezoid, 3-story mud brick buildings with tips of logs puncturing their epidermal membranes. Behold its walls, archaic baked bricks as old as Jericho slathered in bitumen, as the warm pink sun of dawn crawls over their surfaces in an archaic flood of prehistoric light. Behold the man who walks upon its walls with a beard like Sargon's, hair tied back in a bun, bare-chested, garbed in a lambskin kilt, lapis bracelets on his right wrist, and a necklace of carnelian beads on his chest. 3 guards with copper helmets and bronze-tipped spears attend him, ancient Praetorian guard, bored, silent, impassive, and unmoving. He is alone with the dawn, as the sun, a magmatic ingot in a forge, sears the distant palms and tamarisk trees, as the early fishermen cast nets upon the lavender river in the quiet of the first birdsong. From up here, the bent reed bundle huts of the fishermen's marsh houses rustle and creak in the wind, a landscape of enormous dinosaur vertebrae. Toy boats down in the harbor curved like the crescent moon with triangular sails, a study in proto-geometry. Merchants, his grandfather's legacy of working out the conditions of the first international trade, from Magan, Malua, and Dilmun, have come up the Gulf and are already at work upon the brown and emerald waters, unloading supplies, wares, goods at the quay, palm baskets of figs, crates of raw lapis and huge chunks still gray from Arata, necklaces of carnelian and steatite beads, and ambergris rosewood teak from Malua, chunks of gold and silver and raw ingots of copper from Magan, baskets of dead stiff fish, sandalwood aromatic incense and oils, cedarwood logs from the Lebanon, baskets of black bitumen from the city of Hit, palmwood crates of turquoise from the Sinai, diorite slabs, granite quartz white calcite from Egypt, tin from the Zubi Mountains, bronze axes, iron daggers from the Black Mountains, pitoi of wine and olive oil from the far distant Minoans, copper from Cyprus, all coming in from the 4 quarters of the known world. The man on the wall watching all this is pacing back and forth, hands clasped behind his back. For dreams have troubled him from his slumber, dreams of a rock from the sky that crashed, burning orange into the mountains, an egg made of stone from out of which a man hatched, covered in embryonic slime, and knew the man called Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, and was coming for him. The dream bothered him. It was true because just very possibly it meant the gods were not happy with him, and he knew the sorts of consequences that could ensue for one city if it drew the ire of the gods. He had been fucking too many girls lately. That was true. Two girls about to be married, especially. And he kept pouring his semen into their tight pink holes more and more lately, sometimes 2 or even 3 times a day. Where did all that juice come from? He didn't know. But hardly an ass in white linen or lovely flax would go past him. Then he would thrust the girl into an alleyway or a courtyard and raise the hem of her dress and slide his huge pink member in while the girl moaned her pleasure. But he would just squirt his juice and go about his business, leaving the girl behind to wonder what had just happened to her. It was becoming a problem lately, a problem that he couldn't control. He knew there were complaints, murmurings, discontent, but he had rescued the city from Akka, and he had raised its walls against the gigantic floods that sometimes rose high enough to turn the palm fronds into strangely elegant boats that looked like one could float in them across the ruinous, stagnant, mud-drenched waters. But his walls kept those waters out of the city, and so the girls with brown skin and black hair were his to fuck whenever he wanted. The city owed it to him. It was his right, and he would do as he pleased. And besides, if he could impregnate as many of them as possible, his name would be inscribed within the sinews, bone, calcium, flesh, cartilage, and blood of his offspring. For whatever their husbands might think, they were his offspring, and they would make him immortal. 2. Aruru, the goddess who had created, under the direction of Enki, the first 7 men and the first 7 women by pinching them off as pieces of riverine mud, and they had awoken on the riverbanks beneath the palm trees, and all of them began to fuck each other, an orgy of fucking and moaning and coming and squirting the juices that would make more humans to build the cities that would serve the gods, and that depended on the flow of those juices, the precious juices from the loins that squirted into the women and made their bellies rise like the mounds of Egypt. And after 9 moons, they would push forth the gray embryos from their pink holes that stretched wide enough for them to crawl forth from the ancient darkness and peer out into the light as they unfolded their limbs and opened their eyes as they shifted from a world of black shadow forms, uterus, placenta, caul, umbilicus, all sensed, felt, plant-like, but outside a world of absences and far distant objects that had to be sought and fought for in order to be reached. The women had gone to the temple of Aruru and beseeched her with bowls of milk and baskets of figs and jugs of beer and lambs whose throats they cut open to watch the blood squirt all over the feet of her statue, blood between her toes, all squishy and warm. How could she resist their pleas to make a golem or a mashkim big enough and strong enough to overpower Gilgamesh? And so it came to pass, one night in the dark mountains of the uplands, where the source of the rivers poured down past the cedar forests, a rock fell to the earth and cracked, its shell wide open, a granite egg with a huge pink human inside of it, all hairy and sticky with amniotic fluid, that he had to rise and wipe away from his body with leaves and grass. And this event was witnessed by 2 other beings. A creature in the forest named Humbaba, who watched from the trees with burning amber eyes, and a distant huntsman who was setting traps for his animals. The hunter watched him carefully, for he ran with the gazelle herds, and he saw them eating grass, so he crawled on all 4s like them, and began to eat grass, but it made him sick, and he kept throwing it up, and when the wolves came, a pack of 3, he watched them tear down a gazelle, cracking it open and red juice squirting from its neck in a geyser. He did the same thing, and when a panther came, he wrestled with it, fought it in a furious red agony of bloodlust that made him feel alive. Even the raking claws of the panther on his back excited him to bloodlust. And he tore the panther's jaw from its skull with his bare hands and roared his ecstasy into the forest, loud enough for both Humbaba and the huntsman to take notice. He found a small cave near a lake that he lived in, and during the daytime the azure sky would turn the lake a deep cerulean blue, and he would sit before it with the cave behind him and stare at his reflection in the mirror lake, and could not understand what he was looking at, for he could see the tree behind him growing from his back with a dove upon one of its branches, as though some calligrapher had painted it there, and it drove him forth in a blind raging fury, and he caught the dove and ripped its head from its body with one pull of his enormous hands, and the blue-green landscape that surrounded him with its enormous beauty could do nothing to quell him, not even the distant haze of the lovely snow-capped mountains, where the sun coated them with lemon yellow brighter than gold. For he was not yet human, but some kind of creature that walked and shambled and grunted, but could understand nothing of being human at all, for he lived in an agony of fury and discontent that caused him to destroy every animal he saw and eat them raw, tearing the flesh from their bones, and the pile of bones in his cave grew larger by the day, and he did not know the reason for his being, and it was driving him mad. 3. The huntsman, who lived nearby in a small brown lime-plastered house with a stone floor, witnessed all of this, and he was terrified, so one morning he awoke and followed the dusty brown road that led down past the pines and the cedars to the palms and the tamarisks and the poplars, where lines of onagers bearing humans carried tents skins, ostrich eggs full of palm wine and beer jugs of water, and baskets creaking with date palms and figs, and even heavy bags with chunks of gray-blue lapis lazuli, all making their way into the city, where the huntsman sought audience before the Lugal. And he placed his left hand into his right hand in the gesture of greeting, and bowed to the stone floor, and the Lugal told him to rise, and offered him a cup of palm wine, and the room was crawling with orange shadows from burning torches on the walls, and the huntsman explained everything that he had seen, and as he talked, he noticed that the Lugal became strangely pensive, rolling his scepter that was divided into 9 concentric bands of lapis lazuli, alternating with triangles of white shell back and forth in the fabric valley made by the kilt between his knees. After seeming to give the matter some thought, the Lugal bade him take with him a whore that he knew by the name of Shamhat, a whore which the Lugal would summon for him to take back to the man-creature in the hopes of civilizing him. After the huntsman left his audience chamber, Gilgamesh would see no one else for the rest of the day, and instead he spent it sipping beer from a clay jug with a long straw, and he drank so much that it made his head spin, because now for the first time ever, a strange anxious feeling had overcome him as he remembered his dream, and now he felt fear, real fear, for the first time, the kind of fear that one only feels when one knows that the gods have taken sides against one. 4. Shamhat spent the journey onto the uplands complaining as she rode on the back of the onager that made her butt sore and her pussy sore, and the flies kept bothering her, and she didn't like the huntsman's gruff and laconic manner with her. He hardly said 2 words to her when she asked him questions, but she was doing this favor for her Lugal, the great Gilgamesh, whose cock she had sucked for him many times, sucked it so well, in fact, that he claimed he had the best orgasms he ever had, squirting it into her mouth and way down the back of her throat. So she was happy to do him this favor, for she was one of his favorites, after all, but the journey was miserable. Soon the palm trees died away and gave rise to pines and cedars and rocky hills, and eventually they spotted the strange pink long-haired human thing that lived in its cave by the azure lake with the limpid water that mirrored flotilla of clouds, and the huntsman instructed her very carefully what to do. So she approached this strange creature as he sat outside his cave and immediately removed her linen dress so that he could see her beauty, her nipples, and the black triangle between her legs, and those things made him stop as he was squatting down near his pile of bones. And when she then got down on her hands and knees and raised her buttocks as high up in the air as she could so that he could scarcely see her glistening pink vulva, she looked back over her shoulder with some anxiety to see what he would do. But she was delighted to see that his member was erect and that it was huge and dark with a bright pink head on it, the kind she liked, and she watched as he approached her and squatted down a bit to slide it inside of her, and it felt so good that she came almost immediately, and he kept pounding it into her, and she kept coming and coming and coming until finally he finished with an enormous burst of juice inside of her that felt wet and warm and good in there, one of the best she'd ever had. And she, Shamhat, the whore of the Japar, had had many, many fucks, but this man-creature had made her vulva shudder with so many orgasms that she lost count, and she lay on the soft dirt of the ground, her vulva still convulsing as she looked up at the turquoise sky and wondered from whence this man-thing had come. Over the next 7 days, she taught him to speak, and she found out that his name was Enkidu, and she told him about the city and the festivals and the harlots there that were like her. He could fuck as many of them as he wanted, and there were men he could wrestle and fight. And finally she told him about the Lugal Gilgamesh and the frightening dreams that he had been having, but all Enkidu seemed to want to do was fuck her, and so for now she let him have his way with her. All right, we're moving on to the second tablet of the Gilgamesh story. They were with the shepherds, and they gave him beer and offered him bread. But Enkidu would not eat the bread. He only wanted to drink the beer, and he grew merry. And the shepherds compared him to Gilgamesh in size, and they gave to him weapons, and at night the wolves came, and Enkidu tore them to pieces, ripping the spinal column from the back of each one and hanging them upon a tree, dangling there like dripping ornaments, and laughing at the horror of the shepherds as he wiped the blood from his mouth. And when he asked who was Gilgamesh, they told him he was Lugal of Uruk, who kept taking the brides before the bridegrooms. And Enkidu grew angry and vowed to rip out his spine, just as he had done to the wolves. And he stripped the skin from the head of a wolf, and he wore the flayed pink wolf skull around the back of his neck, so that its jawbone formed a kind of necklace, and the top of its skull rested upon his own skull, and he smiled with broken, jagged teeth at the horror of Shamhat. They lay for 7 more days beneath the stars and repeated their fucking every night, and then she decided they must return to the city by way of one of the barges carrying supplies down the mud-black currents. And they rode the currents, as Shamhat gave silver pieces to the man who kept eyeing her warily as Enkidu, with his wolf skull on the back of his head, made him nervous, and the river meandered with long, slow, serpentine, greenish algal coils along the green and yellow reed-colored banks, through the marshes, where the fishermen lived in their cube-shaped barasti palm frond huts, and their round reed bundle-arched huts, and the barge which was carrying cedar logs edged its way past river craft, round guffa boats laden with palm wood crates, and long narrow canoes with prows shaped like sickles, in which men with huge punting poles pushed themselves along, and they went past women washing their clay dishes in the river water, and men standing over upturned canoes, painting fresh coats of black bitumen onto them, and children riding on the backs of water buffalo, hanging onto their curved bony horns as the great beasts submerged themselves like hippos. A network tracery of irrigation canals, date palm forests laid out into rows of gigantic prehistoric trees dwarfing them as they passed beneath, looking up at a sky made out of woven palm fronds through which pieces of cobalt blue showed. Through the murky haze on the other side of the river, the city was emerging into view, a serried line of beige buildings, taking shape, and finally the loading dock at the quay, where they were dumped out with a crowd of people, and they joined the traffic streaming in toward the city gate, where palm trees splayed their late afternoon shadows over the roadway, and the city wall was covered with a spider mesh of scaffolding inside which tiny human beings hung, and on the ground near the base of the wall were rows of hundreds of wet, freshly minted mud bricks drying in the sun, and dusty shepherds rested beneath the trees with their goat flocks and sheep hovering around them, bleating at the passers-by, and at the gates a series of cloth awnings had been erected where men and women had laid out baskets of fruits and vegetables onto red rugs, where they sat while prospective customers browsed. Enkidu insisted that he would wrestle with Gilgamesh and do the same thing to him that he had done to the panther and the wolves, and Shamhat was afraid of his wrath, a strange, unearthly fury that was made of something black and darker and more brutal than she had ever encountered in her life before, and it made her want to leave, and she disappeared into the crowd down one of the rain-wet, muddy streets with iridescent, oily pools made by hundreds of footsteps, leaving Enkidu walking naked as people gathered around him to stare, and he muttered only the name of Gilgamesh. The city streets swelled with people, elongated, monstrous, and pale, huge, swarthy, dark, sweaty Moros. A drunk man sauntered past Enkidu, barely able to walk, more people than Enkidu had ever seen before. He stumbled down one street lit with a row of burning lanterns that cast shuddering pools of ovular lucence, where merchants were sitting on the ground with bracelets and necklaces and pendants and ivory combs, and gold hairpins with carnelian tips, silver bracelets and lapis lazuli necklaces, lunate earrings and triangular beads, and cosmetic palettes, and other merchants were selling fried scorpions, and locusts, and larvae, and stall after stall of fried fish, and huge mounds of what looked like dirt piles, and baskets of apples, grapes, and dates, and barley cakes, chickpeas, lentils, onions, garlic, cucumbers, and there were pottery jars, long, tall, and thin, and pitoi full of beer and wine and olive oil, and onagers went past, loaded with leather satchels full of utensils, cups, pans, mortars, pestles, sickles, harpoons, obsidian knives, and the twilight was descending over the city, a dome of lilac that shaded all the buildings in gradations of purple and violet, and lantern light was flowing in cavernous streams from the windows of the shops that were now closing up, and from the rooftops where shadow people were gathered laughing and drinking in the gloaming and sitting in chairs, breathing the warm palm tree air of the night, and the smell of the river upon the canvas of which were painted tiny gleaming orange pools of lamplight from the flickering torches held at the windows of the night shops. Enkidu continued down the mud-lined street where urine and waste collected in runnels along the side of the road, the street that carried him past clusters of two-story buildings with flat roofs and upturned pointed corners at the top of which pigeons and crows collected like gargoyles, women carrying pots on their heads passing him along the narrow street, and men leading donkeys with yellow eyes and even yellower teeth. One man carried a pair of jars balanced on a wooden pole slung over his shoulder, and he came to a dimly lit alleyway which led him to a courtyard souk where merchants were offering a variety of wines for sale. There was a colonnade with a latticework of wooden beams and poles beneath which merchants sat on colored rugs surrounded by jugs of wine. There was a long row of disheveled buildings that were coming apart at the seams and looked as though they had been hit by an earthquake. Here, the vendors were grouped into districts by trade, and Enkidu found himself in the artisans' quarters. Slave boys dressed in cream-white robes displayed precious stones to rich merchants who had just disembarked at the quay. One man was carefully checking the balance of a wooden scale, in which carnelian beads had been set against silver ingots. Another man sat cross-legged near a pile of wicker baskets, each filled with a different type of bread. Gilgamesh, meanwhile, was headed with his guard to a wedding so that he could fuck the girl first, and eventually Enkidu spotted him with his guards, trailing closely behind him, and he knew it was Gilgamesh. He could tell by the necklaces and bracelets and the arrogant, regal bearing, and he stood in the doorway of the crumbling house where the plaster had broken away into sores that exposed the baked bricks beneath. And the soldiers stepped forward, but Gilgamesh, smiling, waved them away and slammed into Enkidu with full force, just as though he had been waiting for him for this moment. And Enkidu met him with full force, and the two fought force against force with equal measure. And Enkidu choked Gilgamesh and tried to dig his fingers into his jaw to pull it away from his skull, but Gilgamesh bit two of his fingers off and spat them out, and the great beasts of men slammed like wild bulls into the side of the house, while people on the rooftops above screamed, and chips of plaster went flying like broken teeth, and they marveled and gathered in the streets as the two struggled and fought, bleeding and bruised and broken, and the bemused soldiers standing watching, and finally the two sat down exhausted, laughing, smiling, and Gilgamesh told him that he had never been beaten before, and the two agreed to be friends. By now Gilgamesh's mother, escorted by a retinue of guards and borne on a litter, had been brought forth, and she was not amused, but she told Gilgamesh that this was the man from the meteorite that he had dreamed of, and that Enkidu was not a man with kith or kin, but someone from another world, and then also that she had received a dream that an evil spirit in the woods had taken control of the cedar forest and blocked all access to it, and nobody could get the precious cedar logs that were needed to build the roofs of the houses of the city, and that Gilgamesh would have to do something about it. And he laughed and asked the name of this creature, and the mother said that it was Humbaba. And at this, Enkidu went white and told Gilgamesh that he knew Humbaba very well, and that Humbaba was as tall as a cedar tree himself and looked like a tree made flesh, and that when he walked the ground shook, and he moved through the trees of the forest which made way for him as he walked, and that Humbaba was the only creature in the world that terrified Enkidu. He explained all this as a woman bandaged the stumps of his bleeding fingers, and Gilgamesh laughed once more and called Enkidu a coward, and told him that they would go and kill this creature that was so insolently blocking the flow of cedar wood from the north. For Gilgamesh was a master builder. He had built a temple to Enlil in the city of Nippur, and he had provided the plans for the building of the walls of the city of Uruk to defend against the floods. And now he would provide for his people once more. And he was not afraid of monsters, but Enkidu still looked pale in the warm night air as the glow of a lantern made his face appear swollen and puffy. It was getting late, but they went to the blacksmith shop, where they could hear the noise of the hammers banging away long before they had actually seen the shop, an old rickety hut with a sloping roof supported by rotting crossbeams, inside of which an old man with watery eyes sat on a stool while the hammers of his sons made a deafening cacophony all around him. He was surrounded by copper pans and pots, spouted ewers, coils of copper hanging from pegs on beams, copper vases and plates and jugs and jars and stacks of bronze ingots. A luminous incandescence burst forth from the shop to light up the shadowy street with its weird, unearthly night radiance spilling from the forges, and Gilgamesh and Enkidu, his fingers still bleeding, from henceforth men would call him Enkidu Half-Hand, and Gilgamesh, with his 3 guards following behind him, told the blacksmith to cease his work, a bare-chested man with sun-dried brown skin wearing a stained linen kilt, who set down his hammer and hobbled over to them with a slight limp. His hands and arms bore a cartography of scars from the endless wounds which molten metal and high-temperature furnaces had inflicted on him over the years. He gazed at them with veined, bulging eyes, and looked at Gilgamesh, bowing to him as the Lugal of the city. "Yes, Lord, anything for you," he said, and Gilgamesh carefully instructed him to make for them axes and sickle swords, and the blacksmith smiled with a crooked smile that split open the cracked leather of his ancient, withered, aged face, and set to work, feeding kindling into his forge, then picked up a pair of tongs that he used to grab pincher-like a huge metal ingot, and he lay it into the archaic forge, which lit it a bright, luminous, fiery, magmatic orange, and he pulled the ingot out with tongs, and then turned it upside down, and used a hammer and chisel to burrow a hole into it while it was still burning hot. Then, using his bronze hammer, he kept hitting it to flatten the end of the axe, and then they watched while he measured and cut a piece of ash wood, and then he carefully polished the ash wood, then hafted the piece of metal to the ash wood, and sharpened the blade until it was glowing again, then dipped it into a cooling reservoir, filed it some more, and finally handed it over to Gilgamesh, a consummate piece of work that Gilgamesh admired, and then demanded that he repeat the process, and the blacksmith made another axe identical to the first, and then 2 bronze sickle swords. It took him all night to do the work, and he was exhausted, but anything for his Lugal. In the cherry-colored light of dawn, Gilgamesh, though hungover, sat in the courtyard of the city upon his throne, and announced to the town elders that he and Enkidu would be setting forth to slay Humbaba, the creature that guarded the cedar forest, and they all demurred and mumbled and advised him against such rash actions, for he was a young man and did not understand that his mortality was at stake. But Gilgamesh insisted that the deed would make both him and Enkidu immortal, and would inscribe their names and the names of the gods of Uruk into the tablets of the maze forever. And he laughed at their cowardice and said that he had already made up his mind, and that both he and Enkidu would be leaving soon to slay Humbaba so that the wood could flow again. Third tablet. The sun had not yet risen, and the city was full of the sleeping dead, animated only by their dreams, an invisible horde of astral bodies which had left their bone bodies behind and traveled to the radiant worlds of phantoms, shades, and luminous beings made of soft jellyfish plasma that could assume any form, and sometimes it was the dead who would wear the plasma like a mask and speak to the dreamer from the outer darkness beyond. "Come, my friend, let us go see my mother, the Lady Ninsun. She is wise, she knows everything." And so to the shoddy, crumbling temple called Igalma, they went past a pair of copper bulls at the entrance, flanked by 2 palmwood columns, sheathed in a delicate inlay of triangle made out of pink limestone, mother of pearl and shell. 2 torches were burning at the entrance, one of them upside down, and they made an island of vanilla lucence out of the chipped facade of the old building wall against the all-surrounding abysses of the blackness that engulfed the silent street, though a dog was barking somewhere, as they entered the dark maw of the entrance and ascended a flight of steps toward a room that was shuddering with orange candlelight. The Lady Ninsun, when they entered, was kneeling before the skull of Lugobanda, which she kept in a niche in the wall with a pair of bull's horns above it, and she was reciting something under her breath that was too soft to be heard, though it was a continuous muttering, and she had a candle in a calcite bowl on the floor in front of her that cast a dome of orange lucence that drew gibbering shadows on the walls about her, as she invoked the ghost of her dead husband, whose presence could be felt about the room. And when she saw Gilgamesh and Enkidu, she unclasped her hands, the left one inside the right, and got off her knees, and rose to her feet, and kissed her son's cheek. "Mother, have you heard that I will walk the path to the cedar forest to kill Humbaba? And when I return, I will institute a second New Year's festival, one for the month of Tashritu, to balance like a pair of scales the Nisanu festival in the spring. For the other will be in the autumn, as it was of old, just as father had it. Will you give me your blessings for the journey? I will need them. And what does father say about it?" "He wishes you well, and he foreknows the outcome, as all the dead do, but he will not say it, and I didn't ask because I don't want to know. And now I will invoke Shamash for protection for your journey, but first I must make preparations." And she lit cedarwood incense inside of a silver burner that freshened the air. And she bathed 7 times, one for each of the planetary spheres, and slid upon her body a white linen dress, and then a necklace of gold and lapis lazuli for the sun and the blue sky, and then a tiara of gold poplar leaves on her graying hair. She went past the alabaster statue of the cow goddess in a niche, and then ascended the creaking old cedarwood staircase that led to the roof by herself, and on top of the roof she had a view over the blackened city where a few watchfires burned in the darkness, dim glowing flame roses, and she could see night watchmen in the far distance walking the walls, stick-figure phantoms with elongated shadows, and she turned to face the eastern horizon where the stars were dying and lit a piece of cedarwood incense as the sky grew faint with lavender luminosity. "O Shamash," she heard herself say, "who clears away the darkness and brings light to the people." It was an old exorcism ritual, used only for those possessed by dead ancestors, but she thought it appropriate for the journey her son was about to undertake. "O Shamash," she went on, "when you go through the gates at the end of the day, the people's light turns to darkness. O Shamash, as you rise, the world brightens, and people begin to move about, animated by the energy which you pour into them by your very presence. In your radiance, all mankind warms itself, and when you are in the world below, as you travel through the darkness, the dead light up and glow as you pass, and when you are gone, they collapse once again and cease all movement. O Shamash, you who let the planets, the herds out of the sheepfold at dawn, please protect my son on his journey to the cedar forest, and watch over his path, for will he not walk in your pathway, and will he not one day join Ningishzida in the world below?" The eastern horizon was shifting hues from lavender to salmon now as she burned more incense, and said, "O Shamash, light of heaven whose effulgence brightens the darkness, great lamp of the vaulted sky, you spread your fiery lucence over the world, burning shadows even out of the distant mountain ranges, and so with your mighty sun winds you will burn the dark shadow forms out of the cedar forest, and uphold the journey of my son the wayfarer, who sojourns upon your stage, for you are ever guiding those who wander the roads beneath you." After her ritual invocation to the sun god had been completed, she went back down out of the orange morning light into the temple room below and to Enkidu, and told him that though he was not born from her womb, that she hereby formally adopted him as her son, and that he and all the lost ones like him would be raised and taken care of by the harlots, whores, and lucor priestesses of the Japar, who tended the rites of Inanna, and who would take in all orphans. And she put a necklace of seashells around his neck, for seashells are objects one chances to come across. And Enkidu began crying. He did not know that such a thing as human tenderness existed. And Gilgamesh turned uncomfortably away while his friend cried, and his mother held his right hand in her own. And having turned, he disappeared for a time into his own private invisible space. He faded ghost-like across the room to the skull of his father Lugabanda, and picked it up out of its niche. The jawbone was missing. It had never been found, and that had always worried him, for a Baru priest could perhaps use it in a divination ritual against his family. Worried him, too, because he did not know, and no one ever knew, what had happened to his father. He was simply found lying dead in his bedroom one day, while the sound of buzzing flies filled the room with late afternoon air. Poisoned, perhaps, he suspected, by the lucor priestesses, who had then immediately installed into the office of N-priest a young man who took the name of Dumutzid, and was strangely compliant with their wishes. But his reign was a short one, and Gilgamesh at the age of 16 had suddenly found himself in the office of the N and ruler of Uruk. And when they went to dig up his father's body to retrieve the skull for Kishpu rites, the jawbone was mysteriously absent, and Gilgamesh wondered about his great-grandfather Miskaya-Gasher, Enmerkar's father, and the founder of the city, who had gone on a sea voyage to Magan one day and simply disappeared and was never heard from again. Gilgamesh wished that he could go down into the underworld to visit these shades and ask them of their fates, for the enigmas of the lives of his ancestral dead haunted him. Later in the day, Gilgamesh held one more council in the palace courtyard, and the village elders implored Enkidu to take care of their king and Lugal, and admonished Gilgamesh to allow Enkidu to lead him and go first, for he knew the way to the Cedar Mountain. He had been there before. He had seen the monster Humbaba with his own eyes, and Enkidu would look out for him, and they also reminded him to dig a pit into the ground at night when they slept, to keep away the night spirits, and always to keep fresh water and a leather skin to pour libations to the dead, and to invoke the shade of his father Lugabanda. And Gilgamesh was moved, felt tears in his eyes at their concern for him, and thanked them. But then he smiled and laughed and said he did not think there would be any trouble dispatching Humbaba, despite Enkidu's terrified warnings to him that such a deed was an impossibility and could not be accomplished, as Enlil had specifically appointed Humbaba to watch over the cedar forest, so that it did not become depleted of its trees. But Gilgamesh pointed out to him that Shamash was his tutelary deity, who had appointed him to dispatch a beast that Shamash the sun god hated, and so Shamash would protect them, side with them against both Enlil and Humbaba, and that Enkidu need not worry, and they would be leaving in the morning. All right, we'll stop there for those first 3 tablets. So we've done the prologue in a separate video for those of you who don't know about it. And this is the first 3 tablets. The PDF is available if you're interested in purchasing it from me for $20. Hit me up at johndavidebert@gmail.com. I also do astrology readings if you're interested in that. And all right, we'll see you with tablet 4 coming up next, 4, 5, and 6.